But in war, particularly in a war like World War II, you have what are called multiple theaters, okay? So a theater, again, is like the location of where the fighting takes place. And yesterday we opened with the Pacific Theater. And what's frustrating for me is to teach you that there was this thing called the ABC-1 agreement. And then to say, yeah, we're going to get Hitler first, and then our first major battle is in the Pacific. So it's like I'm contradicting myself. But, so recognize that there is really almost as if we're fighting two wars. Yeah. So the Pacific Theater is going to be the focus primarily of the bulk of the U.S. Navy. So absorb that, the U.S. Navy, most of our carriers, almost all of our carriers in the Pacific, okay? The Marines are in the Pacific, and some divisions of the U.S. Army. Not nearly as many as are in the European theater. So the Pacific Theater has the Navy, so keep that in mind. You know, we're talking about Admirals Nimitz and Spruance and Halsey. That's the Pacific Fleet, okay? The Marines and the Army that fight in the island hopping campaign. So if you were to talk to a veteran, and they're getting so few now, 3,000 a day die. If you were to talk to a veteran of World War II, you really have to open with, well, where were you, where was your station? Where were you deployed? Because if you were deployed to, say, Sicily, that's a very different experience than if you were deployed to Kwajalein or to one of the other islands in the South Pacific, like Saipan. If you were in Belgium in the winter of 44, 45, you were freezing your rear end off. You almost died of exposure. If you were in Guadalcanal, you almost drowned from mudslides. You know, so it's a very, very different experience. So we have the Pacific Theater, which includes both the joint actions of the Navy, the Army, and the Marines. And then we have the Atlantic Theater, okay? And in the Atlantic Theater, there's really what's called I shouldn't say the Atlantic Theater, it's the European theater, but there is what's called the Battle of the Atlantic, but it's almost entirely fought against submarines. So when you think about the naval war in the Atlantic, it's the attempt to continue to convoy American troops and American stuff under, you know, the help to the Brits and things like that. But it's the development of methods to get around the submarines. So that's the Atlantic War primarily. And then the European theater is going to be something we don't even actually get involved in until November of 1942. You see this? So look at this date right here, November of 1942. So if you go back over here, August of 42, our ground troops are in Guadalcanal. It will be until November that the first Americans arrive of 42 in North Africa. So I think we were at the Allied halting of Hitler in the reading. And so I have a couple sets of notes for you here. But before that, I do want to just let you understand where the deployment was. So here you can see the winter of 42, the German advance. So they have made it all the way to Moscow and all the way to the outskirts of Stalingrad, and they're doing very well. They control all of France, either through their puppet regime in Vichy or through occupation of northern France. And then, of course, the Italians are down here, the other axis power. And if you look here, you'll notice that the Italians already controlled Libya. That was already a part of the Italian empire, if you want to use that word. But the Germans are now in North Africa. So this is this area right here, which is today the country of Morocco, it was then too, was actually controlled by the French. This was Vichy France. But the French who were sort of loyal to the Germans, if you want to say that. And then the rest was German occupied and Italian occupied, this part right here. So you had like the Germans all across North Africa. And you can see they're pressing towards the Suez Canal. They're pressing towards Iran. And they're closing in on the Middle East, kind of like a two-front pincher, right? And that's when we enter the war. Now, I've mentioned this fella a few times, and I want you to write him down somewhere in your notes. He's not mentioned much in the book, unfortunately. So there are going to be several five-star commanders during World War II. And it gets kind of tricky because then you're like, oh, who outranks who? MacArthur is actually the longest ranking general at this time in history. So actually, MacArthur is a five-star general in the Pacific. Marshall is a five-star general, but he is going to stay in what is called the War Department in Washington, D.C. So this will be the general who will be directly advising President Roosevelt, like, and coordinating the entire war effort. So you're talking about a huge effort, you know. And this is the fellow who actually had done the logistics of the Battle of Meuse-Argonne. So he's already commanded large number of troops, so to speak, in the field. So I definitely need you to know General Marshall, and he's in the War Department. Later on today, we would call him the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but they didn't have those things yet. So he was just the ranking 5-star general. I told you they were fighting in the Atlantic, and this is called the Battle of the Atlantic. And obviously, before we can send American soldiers to Africa, which is where we're going to decide to send them, we have to guarantee that we can send them across the Atlantic Ocean. We don't want to send tens of thousands of guys in vessels that are going to get sunk. So the initial sort of desire by the American Navy and the British Navy is how to overcome German U-boats. And you're going to see a lot of sort of trial and error. Early on in the war, we're still using sort of World War I technology. But pretty soon, and again, the depth charge has been around since submarines have been around. So what this is if you're not familiar with depth charges, it's like a big can, a big barrel with explosives in it. And it's got a fuse that's rigged to a certain depth to explode. So at that depth, then the fuse ignites and the barrel explodes and creates a shockwave underwater, which can crumple the hull of a submarine. In fact, some people say that is the most horrifying military experience of any of the military experiences, is being in a submarine during a depth charge attack. You know, because you're in a can underwater and explosions are going off all around. Any number of them could just collapse the whole of the submarine. So depth charges are one thing with these fuses. They would begin having planes fly over sub bases and track submarines by number, like figure out what the subs were. Okay, radio would then send that in. The development of radar becomes very, very helpful. This is a new scientific development to help spot submarines. And then we'll start targeting. You may remember that the Germans had taken Norway, right? So the Brits will start bombing the sub bases in Norway and attacking the German sub bases there and in the rest of Germany coastline. But perhaps the most significant development is really a fascinating one, and it's called Enigma. So the Germans had a brilliant code machine. It was a machine that kind of looks like a typewriter. This is Enigma here. And the Japanese had one that we broke earlier called Purple, code Purple. But this place right here, Bletchley Park, is the home of British intelligence. And the British began studying the German codes and were trying very hard to break them. And they weren't having much luck at all. We sent some of the OSS, or our spies, we sent some of them to try to get, and we couldn't figure it out. Now, we ultimately are going to capture one of these devices. There's a movie that fictionalizes how the event occurred called U-571. So if you want a good adventure movie, it's got Matthew McConaughey in it. Pretty cool. But it's not accurate on how we get to one of these devices. But the problem is every day there's a new set of like code instructions on what buttons to insert the information into. So in other words, you can't really solve this thing. It's too many variables. And what's going to happen is you're going to see the development of a computing machine. Now, this has also been made into a movie starring Benedict Cumberbatch. I think it's called The Imitation Game. And in this Bletchley Park, you have this British mathematician who develops a computing machine. His name is Alan Turing. And what this machine can do is what no human possibly can do. And that is to go through every conceivable configuration of the Enigma and crack the code. And so we break their top secret code. Here in America at the University of Pennsylvania, we have a group of women working on developing our version of a Turing machine, a computer. And the first American computer is called ENIAC. ENIAC, which stands for Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, right? And so these are, you're just plugging in numbers, and if you've never seen this movie, it's really fascinating to watch how the Turing machine works. So what we are able to do is to figure out what code to put into the machine. So when we hear the radio transmission or intercept the transmission, we can decode it. But the movie and the reality of this shows a very sad sort of paradox. We can't use Enigma's code often, because if we do, the Germans will figure out that we've cracked their code. And we need the Germans to think that we haven't cracked their code. So you're going to see the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Office of Military Intelligence both having to decide which ships to warn, which ships to protect. Like, they actually have to pick and choose, because otherwise it's too obvious that we've cracked their code. And so this is one of the sort of dilemmas of breaking Enigma. But it's a really cool story, and I encourage you to watch that movie if you can get your hands on it. So President Roosevelt is recommended by General Marshall to create the head of the Allied Expeditionary Force to be Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I think I have him somewhere else. So he sends Eisenhower over with hundreds of thousands of American troops, right? And we arrive in Morocco. So this is where the American naval vessels land, okay, particularly here. And in our very first battle in North Africa, we fight against a brilliant German tank commander who absolutely smashes America's forces in the first battle. It's not a huge battle, but it's a rout. We have to retreat. And at that moment, Eisenhower makes a decision to bring in his former superior, who during World War I, who is a masterful tank commander. And that guy's name is George Patton. And Patton, arrives and starts fighting General Rommel here at Oran. All right. And so here you're going to see Rommel being fought against by the Americans under Patton. And Patton very famously Rommel was the pioneer of tank warfare. He was a German, brilliant field marshal who actually wrote a book on tank warfare before World War II. And Patton famously yells at Rommel's forces, "Rommel, I read your book." And he did. He actually read Rommel's book and used that information to outflank Rommel and beat him. And so America's tank forces are going to drive Rommel back. But it's not a severe defeat. It's just sort of a, they run into each other and Rommel has to fall back. We don't retreat this time. But at the same time, his forces have been advancing across North Africa towards the Suez Canal. And of course, Britain cannot lose the Suez Canal. And so we send hundreds of our tanks, which are not nearly as good as the German tank. This is a Sherman tank, but they are fairly maneuverable, and we have a lot of them. So while the German tanks are a superior tank, we give a bunch of these tanks to the British commander. And you need to know these two commanders by name. The German commander is Rommel. He is one of the all-time great military commanders, although usually the only thing I teach are his losses. And then the British have a very splendid commander too, in the form of General Montgomery, Monty, as he was known. So Monty is going to defend the Suez Canal and win a huge victory right outside of Cairo called the Battle of El Alamein. And this battle is fought in October of 42, and it stops Rommel cold. Rommel has to retreat. And so if you look back at this map, you now have the British advancing, right, through Libya, and Rommel having to retreat, and you have America advancing through Algeria, right? And so at this point, Rommel is actually evacuated by Hitler from Africa. He's like, I can't lose my best general down in North Africa. So the question should be, why did we pick North Africa to be where American troops went? The reason is that Hitler has developed a massive fortified barrier on the coast of France. It is absolutely, it's seemingly impenetrable. Right. This is the very famous Atlantic Wall. And to land American troops from across the Atlantic Ocean into France seems practically impossible. It's impracticality. And by the way, I should point out this. Winston Churchill is very, very skeptical now of an amphibious landing. Churchill had been the Lord of the Admiralty during World War One, and he had done an amphibious landing at a place called Gallipoli, which was in Ottoman Empire in Turkey. And the troops at Gallipoli got slaughtered by the Turks. The Turks wiped out the Anzacs. And so Churchill is very reluctant to support an invasion of France. He thinks it'll end in catastrophe. Right. So this is thought to be the soft, sort of easier way to get into Europe. You go through North Africa and then into Italy. You understand? So that's what we decide to do. We figure Italy's got to be easier to fight with than Germans and France. So Rommel is evacuated, and here at the end of, or the spring of 43, we're in Tunisia, getting ready to launch an attack on Sicily. See it there? Sicily being part of the Italian country. So make sure you know Rommel and Montgomery, and Monty wins the Battle of El Alamein with some American help, by the way. We sent a bunch of tanks to help them. So where is the bulk of Hitler's army? Absolutely, the USSR. So it's something like, it's 3 army groups, 63 divisions, or some massive number of soldiers. I mean, nothing you have to remember. The vast majority of the German army is here, okay? So this was sort of a rear defense that got beaten, right? This is a huge sort of impenetrable barrier on the coast. So it looks like the bulk of the fighting, and in fact, the reality is the bulk of the fighting is in the Soviet Union. And this is where the Soviets, I believe, win World War II. You know, because had they lost this battle, then it's very possible that Stalin would have had to surrender, or at very least all resources would have been tied up in Europe. But what you have is one of the largest battles in history. 2 million people collide here, soldiers, not just, there are millions of civilians too. You can look at the math here. It's almost 25,000 artillery pieces, 1,500 tanks. It's one of the biggest battles of all time. And it is the example of where you'd never want to break the #1 rule of warfare. And that's never fight a land war in Russia in the wintertime, right? You just can't do it. And what happens is, as winter descends, the Germans are somewhat prepared for winter, but Stalin has drawn a line in the sand, so to speak, and it kind of makes sense. It is the city with his name on it, right? And it's also the city that guards the Volga River and the access to the Caucasus mountain range. So this is the last chance for Russia. If this place falls, then the Soviet Union is screwed, basically. And so he tells the Russian, the Soviet military officers, retreat is not an option. If your soldiers retreat, shoot them. So it is either fight the Germans or get shot by your own men. So they have this enormous engagement. We're talking about all through the city, all through the winter. And the thing about it is that the German army is prepared for blitzkrieg, not this. This is not blitzkrieg. This is house-to-house fighting in brutal winter conditions against all types of prepared Soviet military personnel. They don't take the city. They have to retreat. They have to fall back. And so this is the other major turning point battle of World War II. So there are 3 battles that you need to know from memory, all 3 of which are in the year 42, and they come within months of each other. The first is in the Pacific Theater, the Battle of Midway. So definitely remember that. This is June of 42. The Japanese tide is pushed back, right? No more advance, okay? Then the summer of 42, the Germans are defeated in the North African campaign, and they're pushed out. No more in North Africa. So that's El Alamein, the second major battle. And then the third battle is in the winter of 42, and that's the Battle of Stalingrad. All 3 cases, the Germans and Japanese are now retreating back. They're not advancing anymore. So usually in a war, in the kind of the narrative of war history, you have what are called turning point battles. Battles that mean before a team was winning or a country was winning, and now they're losing. So these are the 3 where now, not to say the Germans are losing, but they're not. That as soon as you start going backwards, you got to figure you're not winning, right? And that's what happens. The Germans start retreating from Stalingrad. Okay, they're going to have an entire army get surrounded and captured. This is devastating loss. Now, the Soviets, I told you they win the Battle of Stalingrad, but not without the greatest cost of life in all of World War II. We focus so much on the Holocaust, as we should, as we should, but over 3 times as many Russians die in World War II. 20 million Russian people are killed in World War II. And that is a staggering number, 20 million people. And Stalin believes, and he's not wrong, he believes that this is what Churchill and Roosevelt want. Now, why does he think this? Churchill, particularly, would be extremely comfortable with having the Nazis kill the communists, and vice versa. The Hitler's regime and Stalin's regime could bleed each other white for all that Churchill cares, right? Now, I don't think FDR is quite that callous, but the idea is that if the Germans want to kill the Soviets and vice versa, so be it. That they're not killing British people anymore, and Churchill and FDR both despise communism and fascism. But the reality of it is that Stalin could do what the Russians did in World War I. If you remember World War I, the Russians just surrendered. They treated Brest-Litovsk. They're like, all right, you can have this land. That becomes Churchill and FDR's concern. Will Stalin just quit fighting? And so they have to come up with a way to make Stalin feel more confident. And so one of the things that Stalin is demanding is a second front in Germany. He's like, you guys are dithering around down in Africa. That means Hitler doesn't have to deploy any troops to Africa. I mean, to deal with y'all. You guys you're not helping me. I'm fighting all the fight. So you have the first wartime meeting between the two leaders of USA and Britain. We've had the Atlantic Conference, but America wasn't in the war in the Atlantic Conference. So now America is in World War II, and FDR makes an enormous effort, and he sails to Casablanca. He goes to Morocco personally. Churchill flies down to Morocco, and they come up with, so this is called the Casablanca Conference. It's the first time, we'll call them the Big Two, meet during the actual World War II fighting for the United States. And they come up with ways to try to make Stalin feel happier, feel more confident. The first is first is not related to Stalin. The British and the US are going to work out more their defense of Southeast Asia. So they're going to communicate more on how to defeat the Japanese and increase their efforts there. But they're going to formally invade Europe through Italy. So this is what Churchill will call the soft underbelly of Germany. If you think of Germany as armored all around the coast of Europe, well, Italy isn't as much. So we're going to see them decide to invade Italy through Sicily. And this is the thing that's most controversial. There is a decision made at the Casablanca Conference to kind of make Stalin feel happy that we will fight for unconditional surrender. Part of the problem in World War I was it was not clear how the war, when it ended, would be dealt with. Was it going to be the 14 points or what? And obviously it wasn't the 14 points. So what we agree at the Casablanca Conference is that we will defeat the Axis powers completely. There will be no sort of defeat. There will be no armistice. This is going to be a total defeat or nothing. Now, critics will say that this means that they might have surrendered earlier, but now they fight harder because they don't want to surrender unconditionally. Okay? So there's debate about whether or not we should have said this or not. But clearly it's something that, that Stalin needed to believe that we were in it to win it, not just kind of in it until they died, the Russians. So also at Casablanca, this man is put in command of all operations in the European theater. So that's important for the United States. He was already in charge of the North African campaign, but he'll now be elevated to commanding general of what is called SHAEF. That's what this badge is here. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. All right, so SHAEF. And Dwight D. Eisenhower is a tremendously interesting guy, because he is absolutely likable. You don't meet too many people like this. I've met a few people like this in my life, but they were just nice, right? And that doesn't sound like a 5-star general. But what that makes him is very gifted at working with all the different generals, right? So Patton, who's a prima donna, Montgomery, who's a prima donna. These guys are like celebrity generals who like to flaunt it, Ike is unassuming. Here's a 5-star general wearing a simple field medal, and that's it. Service medal, nothing special about that decoration. And so Ike is picked primarily because he's good at communicating. He's nice. By the way, he's a German ancestry, and his nickname is IKE, Ike, for Eisenhower, just shortened down to that. So you're going to see that word often. And the other thing about Eisenhower is he's very gifted at understanding troop positioning, like movement. So he's not a battlefield commander. By the way, Eisenhower was in Washington during World War I. He hated it. All his friends were over fighting, and he was like a desk general or a desk colonel in World War I. So he didn't like that. But now he has his big chance, and he will absolutely shine. Now, he's no military genius. You understand? He's not as flamboyant or gifted a commander as Patton. He's not as daring necessarily as MacArthur, but he has a great understanding of working with all these countries, generals, leaders, admirals, all of that. And so he's a people person. We might look at it that way. And an excellent general because of that. And so he's going to be put in charge of Operation Torch. And, I've been to Italy. The rumors or the kind of reputation is the Italians make much better lovers than fighters, Casanova. And there's a lot of truth to that. The Italians are not very, historically, since the Romans at least, not been very great fighters. And initially, we land in Sicily with General Patton. Remember, this is the tank commander. And the British get this eastern road to Messina. The goal is to get to Messina, right? That's the city right here. Patton is going to dive westward and then race eastward and beat the British. So look at that direction there. He goes from here all the way up to here and all the way to here in the time the British get to there. Right. So he wants to show off. He wants to beat Montgomery, and he does. He beats Monty. Well, part of the problem was the British were fighting much more like resistance. Patton chose a way smartly of getting around the resistance. That's right. Going through less population centers. So taking you back to this, Patton will lead our troops. Now, it gets confusing to students when you're like, I thought Eisenhower was in charge. Well, Eisenhower is like the desk general in charge of the war in Europe. And Patton is actually in the field commanding troops. I mean, he's riding around in a tank telling people where to go. He even in the movie, the very famous movie, there's a scene where he's directing tanks in the mud at a traffic jam, and that actually happens. Patton was very boisterous and a neat guy, but he's going to win Sicily very quickly. All right. The British and the Americans are going to take Sicily very well. And then we're going to prepare to launch the attack on Italy. So if you look down here, you can see that throughout this period of September and October, we're going to be moving from Sicily up into southern Italy, the sort of southern part of the boot, right? Unfortunately, and this is where, a really bizarre incident happens. Patton, who they called Old Blood and Guts, right? He would basically fight for his glory and his soldiers' guts was the field. But he was a brilliant commander. Like he could get more out of a tank column than just about any person who ever lived. He was a bizarre guy too. He believed he was like reincarnated version of like Alexander the Great. And, he had these sort of bizarre attitudes. My grandmother used to watch Patton's house in Washington, D.C. or in Northern Virginia when he was out of town. She would house sit for the Patton family, which is kind of neat. But anyway, Patton, while in Sicily, I think it's before he lands before they land in Italy, he's visiting a military hospital, an army hospital. One of the things generals often do is pin medals of recognition on wounded soldiers, like Purple Hearts, things like that. Purple Heart is a recognition, accommodation for being wounded in war, And so he's there in this military hospital, sort of like commending the troops who've been injured and shot. And he comes across a guy who's sort of like sitting with his head down and just inconsolable, like crying kind of. And he's like, well, son, what happened to you? Like, what's your problem? And he's like, I just can't take it anymore, General. So today we would recognize this as post-traumatic stress, like somebody who's been exposed to something that's shattered the nerves of that individual. They used to call it shell shock or battle fatigue. So it's an anxiety condition where you just can't calm yourself anymore. Well, Patton, who'd been in the trenches in World War I, is furious that this person who has PTSD is sitting around all these boys who've been shot. And he takes his riding gloves and he slaps the soldier in the face and says, get this coward away from these fighting men, right? And, I don't approve of that, but, it's kind of Patton's personality. But the press gets a hold of that story and they run it in newspapers. And there's a cartoon. I need to find the cartoon made of Patton stomping on a little American private with a swastika on his boot, like as if he was a Nazi or something. So Eisenhower is furious with Patton and he demotes him. Here Patton was going to be in charge of the invasion of Italy and really liberation of Europe. And he orders Patton to Britain to help run fundraising drives in British cities. So Patton has to go talk to old ladies and get them to buy bonds. And he is absolutely outraged. But what can he do? He's outranked. Patton's like begging for a command. So anyway, that's the story of George Patton so far. We'll come back. He will return to fight another day. So one of the saddest battles that occurs, and the Italians, man, they do some silly stuff. Like one of the things, well, I shouldn't say the Italians. I'm wrong. So in October of 43, the Italians declare war on Germany and force Mussolini out. Yeah, well, it wasn't stupid for them. They're going to take our side, right? But it is unfortunate. Now, Mussolini, like I said, will actually be rescued. One of the neat stories in World War II, a German paratrooper, this elite guy, Otto Skorzeny, something like that, will actually lead a group in to rescue Mussolini. And so he comes back. But later on, the partisans in Italy will overthrow him and he'll be executed. So Mussolini's out. Let's just leave it at that. From 43 on, he's gone. So you would think from October of 43, this should be pretty easy, right? By the way, this should be May of 44. I don't know why it says 43 there. But the problem is a couple. First, and so here's May of 44, right? We land in September of 43. Now it's May of 44, and this is how far we've gotten. And so part of the problem is, and if you've never been to Italy, I can attest to this. Italy is a very mountainous country. They have the Apennine Mountains that run down the middle of the country. And to get anywhere across the country, you have to cross mountains. Secondly, the winter of 43 was a very rainy year. And so it is just mud and mountains. And then here comes the bad story. The Germans occupy Italy. So it might have been the soft underbelly when we were fighting Italians, but from May or June of 43 on, we're fighting Germans in Italy. So these are Wehrmacht and sometimes SS forces that we're fighting, and we're getting beat. No, not beat. We're getting slowed down. It's a matter of just of inching our way up the Italian peninsula. And this, of course, infuriates Stalin because he's like, you were supposed to be attacking and pressuring the Germans. You can't even make it to Rome. This is a story of where the Germans and the Axis kept troops and men and supplies in this ancient monastery called Monte Cassino, and we had to blow it off the map. So one of the things that the Germans are going to do, which was really terrible, is to use Rome and places use antiquities for places to put military personnel. So it's like shielding you using a human shield of history. So if are you going to blow up this ancient place because it's got Italians or Germans in it? Well, we did, but that's one of the real sort of sad stories of World War II is a lot of fantastic, beautiful cities are going to be obliterated. Cologne, London. And so this is an example of that in Monte Cassino. But eventually, we make it to Rome, right? And liberate Rome, which is, of course, the capital of Italy. I'd like you to make note of the date. Pay attention to that date. That's June 5th, right? So the next day is the day that D-Day occurs. Yeah, right. So what this should tell you by now is that our campaign in Italy did not work in terms of liberating Europe. We basically had to come up with a new plan because to get from here to here in a year is not good. And so Stalin, like I said, Stalin is furious. So Ike recognizes that this is not going to be the soft underbelly of Europe. Invading Italy through, up through the Alps is not going to get to Germany. So we're going to have to come up with a different story. Here's Mussolini, who's been shot, and his mistress, who's also been shot, hung on display, kind of like piñatas there in the city of Milan. So that's what happens to you, Mussolini. So at this point, the Allied leaders, the Allied commanders are going to meet in person for the very first time, all three of them. So you're going to have the very first time FDR, Stalin, and Churchill meet. Now that's some logistics of itself. So they pick a place that they can get to that they won't get shot down or killed, and that's Tehran, which is in those days they called that Persia. All right, today this is the modern country of Iran. So this is the Tehran Conference, and it occurs in the winter of '43. It's the first time FDR meets Stalin. FDR is starting to show the effects of being president for 11 years, you know. And what they have decided, and this is really Stalin is insisting, is they're going to invade France. So they make the decision to invade France from the west, obviously, and Stalin will push the invasion from the east. So it's kind of like reversing. Now the Russians are going to come in from one side. So if you go back up here to this map, by November of '43, the Soviets have pushed back to here, right? So here's Kiev in the Ukraine. So try to imagine this line being here. So they're on the outskirts of Poland, right? And so, Hitler's had to send a lot of troops both into Italy, right? And more into Poland and into Ukraine. And so he's kind of not running out, but it's a tough strain. Now, of course, the Soviets are being bled terribly. So we're going to make a huge decision, and that is to do what Churchill didn't want to do, and that's to launch an amphibious assault, right? So we make plans there, and they don't decide the time or date yet. That's going to be too big of an issue. But the decision is ultimately made that Eisenhower will be in charge of this attack too. So Eisenhower is basically the commander throughout all the war in Europe, okay? And he will continue to command SHAEF. So what they make plans to do is what we now call D-Day. So the formal name of it is Operation Overlord. Okay, that's the big name of it. You might call it now also the Battle of Normandy, right? So what they decide to do, and they really only have two places where they can attack. The first option, which is the most likely option, is here. Remember Dunkirk? Remember the evacuation from Dunkirk, the miracle at Dunkirk? So this coast of Belgium and France, it's a little place called Calais. So the Pas de Calais would make for a really easy invasion point. Let's see if I can find a close map. Sorry, I'll go back to where I was. So initially, and this is where Hitler thinks the attack's going to come, is up here. You see this town called Le Havre? Above this, I need a better map. So if you can imagine right here, I'll just find one real quick. Give me a second. So if you look at a map of Europe, and particularly where France and England are, you're going to see that it's a really close quarter. Let me see if I can find a good up close. And do that. All right, that'll work. Then we'll just pick this one for now. Europe. So if you're looking at this map, I'll throw another map on here for you. I want you to visualize this. This is a huge question about where are we going to attack, you know, and this is the EU, so it's not time specific, but the geography hadn't changed, folks. Climate change otherwise. So if you look right here, let's see if I can zoom in. We'll crop a little bit here. Sorry, I didn't think about this today and could have had it ready for you. There's Deutschland. Okay. And we'll just zoom on up here. And we don't need Iceland. So we'll get rid of that too. And now I'll be able to explain it to you, I hope. We don't need the EU. See you guys later. All right. So if you're looking at where England is right here, so you see how it's like sticks out right here? All right. So if you look at this map, there's Le Havre. See that? And then if you look right here, there's Le Havre. So here's Normandy. So what Germany thinks, which is the likely thing to think, is the attack's going to come at Calais. I probably should just got a map of Calais. I'll do that. So why would you attack at Calais? Well, you know, Calais is a beach. Okay, it is a beach. And yeah, this is what I should have got all on. This is what you get when you're thinking on your seat. All right, so it is a lovely sort of Myrtle Beachy kind of town, and it is very, very close to England. Can you guys see that right there? So that would totally make sense to launch the invasion. It's easy to ship, the troops across right here. It's a flat beachhead, so you can like walk into the town, so to speak. So naturally, that's where Hitler assumes the attack is going to come, right? Way up here. This area, however, is enormously fortified by massive bunkers, right? By these giant concrete, and I've been in these things. I know a lot of you guys have played video games that simulate them. So I'll show you the Normandy bunkers here. And there's a beautiful, beautiful cemetery there. And if you could ever get to it, I encourage you to. So these things are absolutely impenetrable when you look at it. I mean, what I mean by that is like the Navy can shell this thing for days on end. And, well, we've got the wheel of, ooh, I don't want that way. Let me try it a different way. Give me a second. Let me see if this way works. No, it's going to do the same thing. All right. Sorry. This is what I get for getting a big picture. Let me get a small picture real quick. You think it'll be better that way? What do you think? Yeah, there we go. So you have these, see how thick that concrete is? Yeah. So that's all along France's, western and northern coastline. These massive cannons, they're also reinforced, by the way, by behind them are rows and rows of artillery. Between the artillery and these bunkers are minefields. So it literally is like a wall. And so Hitler, thinks that there's no way the Allies would attack there, right? Plus, just to be safe, Hitler decides to put Rommel in charge of the Atlantic Wall. So he puts his best general defending this. Now, I will tell you a secret. It's not a secret, but a story. One of the things that's good news about the Soviets doing so well in the East is that the soldiers that are manning this thing are kids. They're like teenagers or old men. So, like, in other words, you don't have to be a strong fighting man to pull a cannon lanyard, right? So not the very creme de la creme of the German army, so to speak. And that's actually going to be helpful for us, thank goodness. But, that's what this coastline looks like. And so what our Allied leaders, particularly Eisenhower, do is they come up with a strategy on how to land in that. Now, keep in mind, amphibious landings are notoriously difficult. All right, it's really almost impossible. And the locations for the Canadian and British beaches are actually relatively nice. And by that, I mean they're beach towns. So they're sandy beaches. But where the American attack will come is two of the most difficult parts of the entire Normandy coastline. They're hilly. They have cliffs. I'll show you Pointe du Hoc. Pointe du Hoc was an absolutely, it almost looks like a miracle what our guys did there. This is also recognized at the D-Day Memorial. So this is Pointe du Hoc. And we're going to have some of our most elite soldiers attack this place. I mean, you see what I'm saying about cliffs? So you're like scaling cliff walls kind of stuff, right? That's the guys that are going to be under fire in this thing. And I'll also show you the Normandy Omaha Beach from the water. Omaha Beach from water. So let me see here. Yeah, that's great. Look at that. Oh, it's creepy. It looks like the outline of all. It is. Somebody did that. Wow. Sorry, I know you guys can't see what I'm seeing, so I'm going to show you. Nice. Look at that. 9,000 bodies drawn on the beach there. So they picked Normandy. Well, Normandy is actually the whole region. The Omaha Beach location is picked because at low tide, this is what this is going to look like. So I'll show you what low tide looks like. So keep in mind, the English Channel is very stormy. And the Germans have not only fortified the coast, they have also fortified the water. So what's in the water is a host, I mean, just a ton of obstacles. So I'll show you again what I'm talking about. And so this means our leaders have to decide a very fateful decision. You have these Belgian gates. See how they're metal? They'll rip the bottom out of a boat. If the boat goes over, it just rips it open like a can opener, and then all the people in fall out. These have mines on them, so when the boat would go up, the Higgins boat would go over, it'd explode. So all of these things are usually under the water at high tide. Why would you attack at high tide? Very little beach to cover, right? Compared to low tide when there's a lot of beach. You got all of that to cover, right? You don't want to go all over that because what do you do the whole time? You're a sitting duck. Every gun in these bunkers have been sighted to every foot, basically, on the beach. So these people can pinpoint anywhere on the beach. You're sitting duck the whole time. And so this is what we're going to go up against. Like people are thinking it's insane. So this is what Eisenhower and Schaeff come up with. They decide that the operation will actually start. Initially, the plan for the attack was on June 5th. See, that summer, there was only a few times when the tide was right, the tide and the day. So they have to use like the calendar, and they're doing all these tide and also the storms in the English Channel. So they really only have like a 3-day window of the whole summer of 44 to pull this off. And so the initial plan is to go in on the 5th, right? Well, it storms on the 5th, and they can't go. So the night of the 5th, there's a fairly bright moon, and there's a hope that it won't be, storms the next day. But the water's choppy. So what General Eisenhower does is he uses the first time America has ever had paratroopers. So paratroopers are elite soldiers. They got paid $5 more a month. That's why they signed up for it. A lot of them did. And they're going to actually fly in the dark of night over northern France. And they're going to be dropped behind German lines. Yeah, right. And it's their job to sever lines of communication, to keep bridges intact that they need, and to blow up artillery positions if they can. So they really have this extraordinarily difficult job. It seems like a guaranteed death job. And there is a tremendous book and series about the 101st Airborne, easy company called the Band of Brothers. So if you have HBO or you can get on HBO somehow, check out Steven Spielberg's produced, Tom Hanks produced Band of Brothers, written by a story of the 101st Airborne. I'm getting chills because it's one of my all-time favorites. So, well, it's all kinds of things because they're also having to hook up with the French, who are part of the Maquis, the French resistance. They're having to sever communications, but they're also having to secure areas where our guys are going to land. So and hold beaches so our breakout can occur. And they all miss their spot. Every one of them. We had gliders that were supposed to land like Jeeps and stuff. They crashed. People were killed. We lost a general in the crash. The parachutes got hung in the trees. The Germans shot them down, but they survived and they reformed. And gosh, the 101st was an amazing story. So if you ever see these guys, they're still an American unit, the American Airborne Division. They have a Screaming Eagle patch. You'll see that on their gear, an eagle. And then the other were the Apaches, the 82nd Airborne. So these two units, these divisions, land behind the enemy lines. Okay. And then on the morning of June 6th, thousands of these boats, and General Eisenhower in his memoirs will write that this man, Mr. Higgins, saved World War II for us. This is a fellow from New Orleans who invents a landing craft that is both a boat and then the front of it opens at land. We didn't have one of these before. And so these guys are going to drop in off the big ships and then start heading in. If you haven't seen Private Ryan, you got to see at least the first 30 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. It's, again, Spielberg recreates the Normandy landing, the D-Day landing, the Omaha landing. And guys, I want you to look at this map. I get really excited when I talk about this. Sorry, one of my favorite topics. You look right here, you see the big red one. That's the 1st Division, right? It says 1st. And then if you come right below it, you see the 29th, right? And so if you know anything at all about where you live, there is a big road that runs down through town, right? And it is called Highway 29. And that is because of the extraordinary valor of guys from our community right here in Virginia who formed interestingly enough, a National Guard division who were made up of people from Maryland and Virginia. And so they were called in history the Blue and Gray Division, made up of soldiers from the Confederacy, so to speak, and the Union. And they were from Pittsylvania County, and they were from Bedford County and Franklin County. So the 29th Infantry Division are our guys, you know, and I think about how historic that is because, and so at the end of a couple decades ago now, they were trying to decide where to put a national D-Day memorial. By the way, the letter D in D-Day has no meaning. It's just the letter D, you know, it's just H-hour D-Day. It's just how the military does stuff, you know. And so when they were choosing where to pick as a location for the National D-Day Memorial, they chose the town in America that had the highest percentage of casualties of anywhere. And that town was a little sleepy town in Southern Virginia named Bedford. And the town of Bedford lost an entire high school graduation class of boys, the Bedford boys. They were all killed. So the town basically lost a generation of people. And so per capita, you understand. And so that little town, this town, which is, 40 minutes up north from here, is the home of the National D-Day Memorial. Now, I was telling you about Mr. Higgins. Ike said this guy saved the war because of the invention of these landing crafts, these LSTs, right? And the landing crafts were invented by this guy there was a national sort of like invention challenge. The word went out. Somebody needs to come up with a way to land troops in stormy water. And this guy did it. And so today, the National World War II Museum, like the World War II Museum of America, is in New Orleans because of Higgins, because the guy that invented this boat, he was from New Orleans down there. So I think that's kind of interesting. But anyway, this battle is extraordinarily awful. The first wave gets absolutely massacred. The guys from Virginia are just going to, we're going to see guys going through these obstacles are now going to be exposed, right? They're all going to be open. And so they're going to get shot at, but they managed somehow to take these cliffs. And I stood in the cemetery at Normandy where the Americans are buried. And I looked down at it and I just cannot imagine running into 50 cal and 30 cal and 70 millimeter shells. And, now the Navy bombarded the living daylights out of this thing. But they're in 14 and 20 inches deep concrete, might have given them an earache. So we liberate the coast, but so what? We got to get 1 million guys from England into France. And all we have is a little beachhead. Now, the Canadians and the Brits take their beaches. They're Gold, Juno, and Sword down here. We take Omaha and Utah with enormous difficulty. So now the question becomes, what now? The good news is, remember Patton? Well, Patton was up here, right? So Ike was like, I know a way to use Patton. And they came up with some brilliant trickery, some trickeration here. So what they had Patton do is command a ghost army. And he was stationed right here, very close to Calais. So what I mean by ghost army is they'd have the same men just do the marches all over and over. They had inflatable tanks, wooden artillery pieces. But the German spies thought wherever Patton is, that's where the war is going to be, right? Both Rommel and Hitler knew that Patton was our best field commander. So the assumption was by the Germans, wherever Patton's planning was, that's going to be the attack. And the German spies said, well, Patton's up here and he's coordinated. So what this means is on D-Day, Hitler, when he's notified, says, no, that's a diversion. What's Patton doing? Right? And so now Rommel knows what's up. He immediately radios to the Eagle's Nest or the Wolf's Lair. I forget where Hitler was at the moment. He radios and says, look, this is legit. They're attacking us here. You need to send tank divisions to come stop this assault. And Hitler delays. He's like, I think wherever Patton comes. So now, by the time that Hitler responds, it's too late. And the expression is broken out. And it's because once we get past the bocage, which are these hedgerows, we're able to zoom across France. Because remember, France has not been destroyed. France didn't hardly fight at all in World War II. So we liberate France and are in Paris before right at the same time we've gotten to Rome, basically, only a month after we liberated Rome. So this is a spectacular success, probably one of the greatest military achievements of all time. Okay, and so we'll stop today with the election of 44. You know, amidst all of this, there's another election. Now, it's important to recognize that since FDR has broken the third term tradition, what's a fourth term? You know, so he is going to be nominated on the first ballot, obviously. The only real challenge of the Democratic Convention of 44 is the reality that every Democrat knows that FDR is probably going to die. That's kind of sucky to say, but everyone is expecting FDR to die before he finishes his term. Right. So, you know, they're preparing for that possibility. He looks very sickly. He is absolutely exhausted. He's emaciated. His face has lost all of its color. And they're concerned because Henry Wallace is an old school populist progressive. He is this liberal country boy who doesn't seem as tough or as conservative as what the Dems who are feeling that way about it. The current vice president. So Wallace was the current vice president, Henry Wallace, and he was too agrarian, too country, too old school Democrat. And so instead, they choose to nominate as vice president. FDR doesn't meet him, but he calls down and says, "You're not going to disappoint your country and your president." And so the guy's name is Harry Truman. Now, Senator Truman had been a very supportive, sort of hawkish figure in the U.S. Senate during the war. And he had been very supportive of the war effort and efficient at getting more, he basically could weed out like bad judgment amongst the War Department. He had done a good job of oversight, we'd call it. And so Truman is picked kind of as a conservative, hawkish guy. So in case FDR dies, at least we'll have another tough guy. Truman was known by the nickname "Give 'em Hell Harry," like he was a tough guy. And so he kind of satisfied that requirement. And so he'll be put on the nomination. The Republicans nominate a really gifted politician, but many people think this is meant to be more of a trial run. Tom Dewey is the very popular governor of New York. He's charming, he's a good-looking dude, and he's a sharp guy, but he's not too critical of FDR. In other words, this is where that line "Me Tooism" comes in. He's seen as just nobody really attacks the Democrats much in 44. This is almost as if it's a sacrificial election. But Dewey is, I think, planning to run in 48, which we know he does. There's a very famous headline: "Dewey defeats Truman." Right? That's this Dewey. So Dewey is out there not as a sacrificial lamb, but more as like a trial run, I think. And the unions heavily support FDR, and obviously, just like in 40, when you're in the midst of a sort of a terrible period, most people don't want to change leaders who are kind of getting the job done, kind of like Lincoln way back in 64. So FDR is going to win comfortably, a couple Western states and New England states, notwithstanding. And so we'll get to the end of World War II tomorrow, okay? Or not tomorrow, rather, Thursday. I have posted the test, but, I will stop recording now and see if you guys have any discussions, questions. I got some